A long sigh issued from between Ludmilla's legs. "I do not understand why you have to sound so utterly unenthused," she glowered down at the top of Nonna's silken cowl. "This is utterly banal," Nonna replied. "That is the point," Ludmilla told the elder lich. "Doing something radical here would ruin everything." 500 meters below, 10,000 zombies shuffled through the trees, making their way south towards the goblin army. After flashing out the scouts being sent north, she allowed a few to escape to report the advance of her undead forces. The Death Knights and Death Warriors were positioned far to the rear, though she interspersed most of the squire zombies that she had available throughout the ranks of their weaker fellows. She supposed calling them ranks was probably a poor description. They were simply shuffling forward as fast as they could, in no set order. A horde of the walking dead that would emerge before the goblin army to the south, who would presumably have had ample warning before their arrival. It looked nothing more than a cliché related 1,000 times in the tales passed down by any place with the most basic knowledge of the undead. The elder lich commanders immediately questioned her plan, offering various amendments. Form proper ranks. Equip them with armor and shields, at least. Use the Death Knights and Death Warriors to drive fear and despair into the enemy camps. It was a rare moment when the elder liches felt just as alive as any living being. Their sensibilities were challenged, and concerns bubbled to the surface of their usual dispassionate delivery. "You may play according to whatever rules you wish, but, in the end, you cannot stop me. By the same token, do you think any lesser being can stop you?" Her liege's words might easily be taken as an expression of confidence in an exceptional vassal. It wasn't as if she wasn't gratified by Lady Schultier's words, but the true meaning of them most likely had little to do with Ludmilla at all. It was the inviolable agency of a supreme sovereign, carried forth through those who enforced his will. The behavior of the elder liches underscored this notion. Every action and point was scrutinized, any detail that might be construed to misrepresent His Majesty was criticized. Appearing impotent was not permitted. Retreat was not permitted. Failure was not permitted. Opponents of His Majesty were to be subjected to the most extreme measures in all things at once, somehow. The absolute authority, power, grace, and splendor of the Sorcerer King was to be made clear to any and all who would witness even the tiniest fragment of the Sorceress Kingdom. Rather than foreign, it felt familiar. It was a sort of exceptionalism that one might find amongst nobles and their households, who held the dignity and value of aristocratic culture above all else, or the fervent devotion found in adherents of her faith. She would probably not be wrong to say that they perceived the Sorcerer King as a god, and that they were agents of his divine will. It was an impossible ideal where perfect outcomes were executed perfectly, and anything that fell short of perfection was considered anathema. To Ludmilla, at least, it seemed that way. To the elder liches, it was a matter of course. There was nothing to deliberate over. They would carry this attitude to the ends of the world, or to the end of themselves. Thankfully, they were ordered by Lord Cocytus to defer to her instruction. She had the strong suspicion that they would have gone and done something ridiculous on their own otherwise. Though they shared the conviction that the enemies of the Sorceress Kingdom should be destroyed, the how and why and when of it were fundamentally irreconcilable. They followed after the slowly advancing zombie army, and twilight faded into a clear night under the waning moon. She looked over at one of the elder lich commanders to her left as they came within a few kilometers of the goblin camps. "Take 1/4 of our zombies across the river. Leave the squire zombies on this side." She had the remaining elder lich commanders slow down the advance of the western forces so the new detachment could get to their position on the eastern bank. All 40 of the Death Knights from the day's new trainees were sent into the river, as were all but one of the Death Warriors. The 7 free Death Knights from her domain were evenly spaced along a line that extended roughly 1 kilometer out from the riverbank. With what felt like a brief set of initial instructions, everything was made ready. All that was left was to nudge the goblin army into action. Send the zombies on the western side of the river forward. Summon wraiths and start sending them down into the forward camps. Attack individuals in tents, but make sure they're awake before you kill them. Plenty of screaming, please. The elder liches, the ones from the army, were all more powerful than Nonna, summoned 4 wraiths each, sending them down as instructed. Shouts and screams soon started to rise from below, and she could see the camps coming to life in the wake of the disturbance. "Are you certain this strategy will work?" Nonna asked. "Ugh, why do you have to ask that right as we start?" Ludmilla grimaced. It is simple enough that it should. Their scouts should have forewarned them of our attack. Now we have alerted their perimeter to our presence. Next, we will give them an imminent threat to react against. I don't see how it will play out the way you expect it to, Nana said. Our zombie forces are no match for even one of these encampments. They do not know that, Ludmilla told her. All we have to do is give them the impression that what is coming is weightier than it actually is. To do this, Ludmilla set the majority of her squire zombies along the leading edge of their advance. The goblin army scouts would be able to see how strong they were, and all they would note from further beyond was that there were more and more of them coming. What if the first camps decide to fight? Then they die, Ludmilla shrugged, and we have more zombies to work with. Losing a few of their forward camps will probably not change anything when it comes down to their ultimate response. The ultimate response was her answer to the problem of containing the tens of thousands of goblin army soldiers in the Central Valley. Through the days of clearing the encampments along her southern border, the composition and practices of the army became quite clear. It was a force formed around a core of hobgoblin heavy infantry. Small numbers of bugbears served as shock troops while the vast majority of the army was composed of goblins. These goblins were auxiliaries, serving as scouts, pickets, skirmishers, and logistical components while the hobgoblins represented the majority of their front-line strength. As heavy infantry favored flat and clear terrain, she would attack them where they were. Her purpose was to provide her enemy with the sort of battle that they had trained for, in a location that they found favorable. The tide of zombies shuffling forward would give them ample opportunity to prepare without arousing suspicions about the true nature of their opponent. The hobgoblin commanders would gather everyone in a single battlefield for a fight that they expected, oblivious to the fact that they were conveniently collecting their forces in one location to be decisively defeated. Below, hundreds of goblin pickets scurried out of the forest ahead of her advancing zombies. The wraiths continued their work in the nearest camps, though it appeared that an organized response to combat them was in progress. The wraiths are at risk, Nonna informed her. Should we not withdraw them or attack elsewhere? No, Ludmilla shook her head. They can die, but make them work a bit for it. The first step of our strategy is to instill fear into the northern group. Then we should have gone with the suggestion of the other commanders. That would be too much fear, Ludmilla said. It is as I said a few nights ago, fear on its own is insufficient. The application of fear as a deterrent may also be wielded to goad your opponents into making confident choices. She ordered the elder liches to replace their wraiths and resume their harassment before continuing. How does fear inspire confidence? Fear is only the catalyst, Ludmilla explained. It is the choices available to deal with that fear that can inspire confidence. At this juncture, the camp commanders have two options, fight or withdraw. The unknown number of undead approaching, combined with the constant wraith attacks, will have them withdraw to consolidate their forces with the others to avoid unnecessary risk. It is a choice that they can make with confidence. This army is well disciplined, trained, and rational. They will seek the best strategic options for themselves and their soldiers. They watched the encampments evacuate as the zombies drew closer. Given the attitudes of the elder liches, Ludmilla ventured it was something that they couldn't understand, or at least never consider. If they were to be part of a larger army, however, it was something that they had to learn. It was decidedly strange that goblins could be well versed in this, but her elder liches weren't. Eventually, Ludmilla continued her explanation. This army will reach a point where they will make their stand. The slow movement of our ground forces will give them ample time to analyze the threat and organize a proper response. After a series of confident choices that lead to a series of successes, fear will dissipate, leaving only certainty in their imminent victory. They will make their moves, not knowing that they are being manipulated into making them. Truth be told, it wasn't something that a regular commander could do with a regular army. If she ordered the vast majority of a human army to go sacrifice themselves like this, they would certainly desert. It was a strategy unique to an undead army, playing by rules that no one else could. Unless the enemy commander was capable of framing things in those completely alien terms, it was an undeniable advantage in her favor. As they crossed over the first line of encampments, Ludmilla ordered the forces on the eastern bank to advance in a similar fashion. The Death Knights and Death Warriors submerged in the river were moved ahead to a place just before the first ford. When they reached the second line of encampments, she directed a number of undead to create a haphazard line of stakes stretching before a wide bend in the river. The barricades of the nearby encampments were added as well. To the south, Ludmilla could see the entire cluster of encampments in the central valley in a frenzy of activity. Demi-humans started to stream towards the central camp. Neat, rectangular formations started to manifest on the field before a short platform. On the other side of the river, the demi-humans there started gathering at roughly the same point along the river. Looks like this is the starting point for the battle. Let the zombies keep moving forward, and space our squire zombies between them again. Unexpectedly, the first move from the goblin army was not sending forward their skirmishers to thin the slowly advancing undead, but the appearance of a group of goblins riding wolves. The enemy cavalry swept over the front, taking down several hundred zombies with what appeared to be short javelins. As slow as her forces were, they could do little to retaliate. "Say, Nonna," Ludmilla mused as she watched the tight formation run by far below, "do we get a zombie if a squire zombie kills something with a ranged attack?" "That is unknown." She ordered the suddenly isolated squire zombies that had survived the first attack to retrieve some of the javelins strewn over the ground. As the next wave of wolf riders came in, they hurled their weapons at each other. The squire zombies were too tough to easily take down with light javelins, but they were also terrible at throwing them. Still, the cavalry formation was so tightly packed together that more than a few of the weapons hit something. The Elder Lich commanders started drifting forward, and Ludmilla frowned down at them from above. "Do not do anything yet. Prepare wraiths to retaliate after they start sending arrows our way." She returned her gaze to the fallen wolf riders. After a whole minute, nothing got up. "Or?" Ludmilla pouted. Her overly optimistic idea of having squire zombies operating siege weaponry crumbled away before it could even take shape. As the zombies closed in, a great number of goblins came out from behind the lines of hobgoblin infantry. The ground below was briefly clouded by thousands of arrows before they hailed down on her troops. "That must have been 10 arrows for every zombie down there," Ludmilla muttered. "These goblins are really enthusiastic." She wasn't sure what might have happened to House Zaradnik if the Sorceress Kingdom had never annexed the duchy. She doubted that the royal army of Riestais would have been able to hold this goblin army back. How many adventurers would it have taken to stop them? As instructed, the wraiths were sent down in retaliation. Watching intently as the goblin skirmishers deftly maneuvered behind the safety of the hobgoblin lines, Ludmilla could only nod in appreciation of the enemy army's sound decisions and smooth reactions. They had somehow drilled tens of thousands of goblins into a work of organized chaos. The skirmishers and shock troops were spread out over a wide area. They must have noticed the Elder Liches too. Across the river, the fighting was winding down. She spotted the Elder Lich floating above its decimated forces, and could only imagine the entirely displeased expression on its withered face. "Assume command of the forces in the river. Shadow those goblins' movements, but do not initiate the ambush before I call for it." Another volley of arrows fell below, followed by another retaliation by summoned wraiths. It played out much the same way as before. Ludmilla called down to the 3 Elder Lich commanders hovering just out of range of the enemy lines. "Time to rile them up. Pick out the most well-equipped formations and send some spells their way. Ignore the more poorly equipped hobgoblins for now. Make sure you keep your protections up. Stone is the most common material to fashion arrowheads without here, and they can be made to deal bludgeoning damage." The Elder Liches started their attack, opening up with several fireballs against the hobgoblin lines. As expected, they formed shield walls against them. She had only read about the tactic, but it appeared to be as effective as described. Wraiths were summoned to retaliate against the archers trying to hit her commanders from below, which were in turn intercepted by nearby bugbears. On the other side of the river, the enemy forces had withdrawn nearly 2 kilometers south. "All right, time to start flailing. Feel free to experiment with spells, but do not hit them too hard." Ludmilla observed as a variety of different attempts were made to harm various parts of the goblin army. Apparently, lightning spells were terrible at high angles. With the enemy either hiding behind shield walls or spread out, area effect spells were similarly ineffective. Resorting to single-target attacks when the enemy numbered in the tens of thousands felt like a waste of mana. Tier magic had suspicious shortfalls when it came to spells that could deal widespread damage to large armies like this. Admittedly, there were a few that she knew of that appeared to be excellent at it, such as the Storm of Vengeance spell that Lady Sheltier had cast in Facet County, but they were not spells that Ludmilla would have access to with mid-tier casters like Elder Liches. The Elder Lich commanders appeared to be at a loss as well when they were going over their options for the battle. As far as Ludmilla could tell, aside from the few golden opportunities to land devastating attacks on opponents that were arranged just the right way, magic was better used in a supporting role while powerful physical combatants like Death Knights and Death Warriors dominated the field. Not everyone had Death Knights and Death Warriors, of course, but any strong warrior with adequate support could keep swinging long after several mages had run out of mana trying to eliminate the same number of lesser opponents. When the enemy forces on the opposite shore were nearly to the ford, Ludmilla recalled the Elder Lich commanders. She ordered the zombies below to cease their advance. Shortly after, the ranks of the goblin army started their own. "Oh, they are actually moving," Ludmilla remarked. "I find it disconcerting that you sound surprised over the success of your own strategy," Nonna said. "I expected it to work," Ludmilla replied, "but seeing it unfold right before your eyes is, anyway, how is everyone doing for mana?" Elder Liches gathered around her exchanged glances. "As ordered," one of them replied, "we have maintained minimum reserves of roughly 80%. "Well done," Ludmilla smiled. Back to the second line of encampments. Looking over once again to the south, she called for the fourth Elder Lich commander to commence its ambush against the goblin army forces just starting to cross the river. 40 Death Knights and 7 Death Warriors exploded out of the water and into the demi-human column. The entire formation seemed to recoil at once. From their distance, Ludmilla couldn't hear anything over the current of the Katza River and the sound of the advancing army lines. Within a minute, she could see zombies shuffling into the water, swiftly carried downstream to join Ludmilla at their new position. Below, the commanders of the goblin army appeared entirely unaware that a third of their number was being systematically slaughtered and turned into her reinforcements. She issued her orders to the forces gathering below. "Order ranks. It is time to form our little trap." The dull rumble of tens of thousands of booted feet filled the night air, and a swell of pride filled Avard's breast. Though their adversary had shown themselves to be disappointingly ineffectual, momentous feelings still carried through the hearts and minds of the goblin army. Rank upon rank marched forward armed with grim steel and a sense of greater purpose. "This is what you were born for," the world around them seemed to whisper. "You, who were once weak, will rule the battlefield. Nations shall tremble before you." For Avard, who had seen her tribe fall and suffer under the whims of Yaldabaoth, it was a turn for the better. The Demon Emperor might eventually bring the world to an end, but at least her army would make their mark on it before that end. They would fight and die on their own terms, or perhaps they might eventually grow strong enough to turn around and face Yaldabaoth head-on. After scanning the field ahead one more time before climbing down from her command platform, Avard and her bodyguard joined the rear of the advancing force. The scattered zombies left behind in the Elder Lich's retreat were no obstacle, and the army marched forward at a steady pace. She raised her head, trying to look over the front ranks. "I hope we find a pack of wargs one of these days. A general shouldn't be tiptoeing to get a view." While goblins were small enough to ride wolves, hobgoblins were not. There were several magical beasts that they had come across, but none were suitable as mounts, or they had been too fast to catch. She imagined how wondrous it would be to have a griffin or a hippogriff, riding on swift wings and commanding the field. Of all the tales she knew, none had ever spoken of such a thing. Perhaps she would be the first. "General." The voice of one of her officers interrupted her fantasizing. She looked ahead to where he was directing his formation. "What is it?" "We're approaching the second ring of encampments. There's more undead up ahead." They were fighting a zombie horde. Of course there would be more. "You mean more than expected?" "Ah, yes, that's right, General. A lot more. It looks like they're gathering out there." "Gathering? Not moving forward?" "Nope, they're just standing there." "Distance?" "Just under 500 meters." Avard brought her army to a halt. She jogged up to the front line to see what had been described for herself. In the distance, a line of undead stood parallel to her own. Above, the 3 Elder Liches were floating silently against the backdrop of stars. "They trying to copy us?" she mused. "Who knows?" the officer nearby shrugged. "If they are, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish." She grunted in agreement. Zombies were slow to move and slow to respond. They didn't have any martial arts or skills. Or intelligence, for that matter. They were just lumps of reanimated flesh. If these elder liches thought that creating a rough imitation of formations made out of real soldiers gave them parity, they were in for a rude awakening. Did the scouts see anything out of the ordinary? She squinted out into the distance. Nothing reported, the officer said. Ah, they're moving. Across the field, the line of zombies started to shuffle forward. The damn things were so slow that they looked like they were just swaying back and forth. Ugh, are they really trying to make them move together? Avad said sourly, this is going to take forever. Should we send skirmishers forward? The officer asked. May as well, Avad sighed. I hope there's something left for our main line to fight. Skirmishers forward. Don't wait to volley, loose arrows at will. Watch out for wraiths. The goblin skirmishers came forward, using their shortbows to pelt the makeshift zombie line. As expected, the wraiths came down, driving the archers back after 1 or 2 arrows. Like before, the undead only got as far as the main line before being torn apart. After that, however, a new set of wraiths came down to loiter in the field between the two armies. The skirmishers that were returning to the front stopped partway, loosing their arrows at them. The projectiles mostly missed, and the few that were on the mark passed harmlessly through. Stop that, you're wasting arrows. Get back behind the lines and keep thinning out those zombies once they get in range. Weird, doesn't look like they did as well as before, the officer frowned. Avad was forced to agree. In the previous skirmish, they had nearly obliterated the zombies in range. Now, they looked nearly unscathed. She grabbed the arm of a goblin that was passing by. Hey, those arrows barely did anything. What's going on? The goblin looked up at her, brows drawn together in the monumental effort of answering her question. She looked back out to the approaching zombies before looking back at Avad. Zom. She started, then paused as if she had forgotten what to say. Zom, Iron Zom? Iron Zom? Avad exchanged a look with the officer. Iron Zom. The goblin squeaked. The skirmisher pointed at Avad's shield, then her breastplate. Armored zombies. Avad waved the goblin away. Some zombie variant? The officer offered. It was possible. Undead often mysteriously manifested with weapons and equipment of their own. There was a range of possibilities, but the type of undead dictated what it tended to appear with. The ones they had fought previously were all unequipped, formed out of the corpses of goblins, which were plentiful in the basin. Maybe that's why they thought they could copy us. Your orders, General? She guessed it was a waste of time trying to take them down with arrows. Her hobgoblins and bugbears would be the most effective in this situation. Looks like it's the main line's time to shine, she said. We left flank reporting, we've just made contact with the enemy. Holding fine, but it's a hell of a lot. Avad froze at the report. She looked across the field. Their fucking line is crooked. Those stupid elder liches couldn't even get that part straight. She stewed in her boots, incensed that this mockery of an army should even be allowed. The clash of the two lines rose far to the west. Hobs and bugs, forward. These rotting shits can't even manage a straight line. Quick march. Officers sound charge at 50 meters. Their formations advanced, rapidly closing on the crooked zombie line. One by one, each formation raised their voices as they charged, a wave of steel that washed up against the enemy undead from west to east. Rather than the two masses pressing together in the push of melee, the first two ranks of the zombie army instantly crumbled on contact before the charge fully stopped. Avad snorted derisively. They might be zombie variants, but they were still weak. General. She looked up at the voice. In the formation directly ahead of her, the same officer was waving her over with his spear. What is it? She asked as they advanced to where he stood over a fallen zombie. This armor, it's... A flash of fury washed over her when she realized what he was bringing to her attention. Those evil. She looked across the press of soldiers. Now that the enemy was within range of her dark vision, she could make out the details of the zombie variants. They were adorned in plate mail, wielding spears and shields of dwarven make. They were her soldiers. I want these zombies put into the ground now. These evil assholes have gone too far. Spurred by her rage, the goblin army roared and pushed forward with sudden fervor. It was to be expected, she told herself. Undead were the purest manifestation of evil, enemies of all who lived. The rationale failed to calm her, however. Avad glared at the elder liches silently flying out of range overhead. When did they get the chance to kill and raise her soldiers? Her gaze drifted over to the northern peaks. The report from Zul arrived 3 days previous. The follow-up report was delayed, but not unreasonably so. Was that where it had started? If so, they would have over 20,000 zombies to deal with. The hobgoblin lines continued their northward advance, taking down thousands of zombies as they went. Left flank reporting, we got a big one here. A big one? An undead champion, I guess? About that strong. My hobs are trying to pin it down, but he's a real pain in the ass. What is it? A vampire? Some super zombie? A skeleton of some sort. Bugbearish in size. Black armor. Ah, shit, another one popped up a few formations away. Avad turned her head to see if she could see what was going on. She ended up turning far more than she expected to. Wait, how far back are you guys? We've barely moved from where we made contact. Unearthly howls started to rise across the front line. She scanned her surroundings, trying to make sense out of what was going on. Over the land awash by bright moonlight, her front line had formed into an echelon, with the river to the west. Bugbears on the right flank, gather and punch through. We need to roll around this undead army and finish it off, quick. Anxiety washed over her. Something was very wrong, and they needed to clean up before whatever it was happened to them. A spray of dirt erupted in front of her. She winced away, covering her head. When she looked up again, she found a ballista bolt buried in the ground. No, it was a wooden stake. The officer of the formation ahead of her lay impaled upon it. Another stake streaked in, punching through 2 plate-clad hobgoblins before driving itself halfway into the ground. She fell back behind the protective cover of her bodyguard, who gathered around her with shields raised. The hobgoblin army had strong cadres of elite soldiers, but they didn't have any champions to deal with enemy champions. Avad herself was the closest thing to it, but she couldn't even remotely compare with QRS or even Zvrith. She urged her right flank to make their breakthrough. They needed to find whatever was sending those stakes into their lines like ballista bolts. Another attack whistled by, traveling through 2 bugbears and a dozen goblins before smashing into the ground and tumbling end over end. At least it didn't take down another one of her officers. Were they targeting them on purpose somehow? Avad glanced up again towards the night sky and frowned. The elder liches that she thought might be directing the unseen attacker were gone. Over on the western flank, Ludmilla frowned down at the ongoing battle. Was it going as planned? Or was her plan about to go awry? At the current juncture, it was difficult to tell. As fresh zombie reinforcements crawled out of the river to join her after their journey from upstream, she arranged her army into oblique order. Rather than a traditional oblique order, where a heavy concentration of forces was focused on one side of a battle line in order to quickly secure dominance on that flank, she was just piling up zombies to slow down one side of the goblin army. They certainly wouldn't hold out in the long run. She couldn't bring her personally trained Death Knights into play too early, lest the enemy commanders reacted to their appearance and stopped moving as she wanted them to. All she could do was watch nervously as thousands of zombies were mulched in a matter of minutes by the enemy's heavy infantry. When the 2 lines finally locked into place, some parts on her side were so thin that she had to rearrange her Death Knights to shore them up. Elder liches, head over to the end of the west flank. As she waited for them to get into their positions, Ludmilla scanned the battle below once again. On the opposite side, where the goblin army's echelon had made their furthest advance north, 2 diamond formations were gathering behind the main line. The Wolf Riders used the formation earlier in the night, but she was only aware of 2 groups of Wolf Riders, one on each flank. Worried that they were being gathered for a potential breakthrough, she repositioned the nearest Death Knight to stand opposite to them. The Death Warrior she left behind was nearby as well, pulling up the stakes that served to obscure the zombies coming out of the river. It lobbed them randomly into the mass of the army, some of its attacks traveling over 500 meters before skewering the demi-humans that got in the way. She redirected her makeshift undead ballista in an attempt to disrupt the diamonds on the eastern flank. You could just have its attacks directed against the enemy general, Nonna offered. It should be in the midst of that defensive formation behind the main line. In our case, we need the enemy commanders alive for as long as possible, Ludmilla replied. They need to keep their formations from breaking for as long as possible after we close our little pocket. I guess we need to start now. To the south, the Death Knights and Death Warriors sent to ambush the Goblin Army's eastern detachment were spread out in a long line, rapidly making their way towards the main battle. She signaled the 3 Elder Liches beyond the far western flank to begin. In unison, the undead mages raised their arms over their heads. Triplet Widen Magic, Cloudkill. A yellowish-green mist rose from the ground below the line of Elder Liches. It formed into a bank of noxious fog 180 meters wide that started rolling southeast. Keep going, we need 5 more. The Elder Liches moved south, continuing to place the Cloudkill spells until it formed a wall over a kilometer long. It didn't move very fast, but it was more than enough to serve her purposes. Just before it seeped over the western flank, she ordered the Death Knights there to release the attention of the Goblin Army. Demi-humans turned their attention to the advancing mist, eyeing it warily. When it touched the edge of their forces, 2,000 goblins collapsed, screaming as their bodies turned black and swollen. Their cries did not last long, they were dead within 3 seconds. Many hobgoblins fell and died as well, while those who survived fell to the ground, gasping and retching. As one, the entire western edge of the Goblin Army flinched backwards in alarm. Ludmilla's undead forces were immune to the spell and fell upon the defenseless few that survived. Roll up that flank. Southern force, close the lid. The western flank started folding eastwards. It was slow at first, but gained in momentum as more and more demi-humans scrambled back from the slowly advancing Cloudkill spells while trying to defend against attacks from zombie squires and Death Knights. The regular zombies were being left behind, but it hardly mattered anymore. The southern force swept in from the rear, completing the trap that had suddenly formed around the Goblin Army. While the Death Knights and their army of squire zombies were intimidating enough, the Death Warriors were on an entirely different level altogether. As they charged in, they fired crossbows and hurled the numerous javelins, throwing axes and daggers hanging about their forms. The projectiles each sliced through dozens of demi-humans as they closed the distance. At 50 meters, the Death Warriors catapulted forward, brandishing twin greatswords. Blood and body parts severed in every way imaginable arced into the air as they turned into veritable whirlwinds of death, weaving their way through the Goblin Army. One of them made it all the way to the front line in less than 2 minutes, where it cleaved through a formation of plate-wearing hobgoblins. 18 of the demi-humans, stacked 3 deep, were bisected in a single swing, shields and all. Double the level does not mean double the strength. Lady Shiltier had mentioned this shortly after they met, but seeing it was an entirely different thing altogether. The offensive power of a Death Warrior was clearly more than twice that of a Death Knight. As all sides closed in, the Death Knights fell back onto their filtering tactics, using their skills to arrest the attention of nearby opponents while picking off those that broke and ran. Ludmilla continued fixing potential weaknesses in their encirclement. Cut off the riverbank, I don't want any swimming away. Once our encirclement is secure, slow down a bit. Make sure you pick out the squire zombies that you want to take back with you. What followed could only be called a slaughter. Ludmilla quietly watched from above, and her eyes eventually fell to rest upon the Katza River. It appeared that Entima was right in the end, after all. After the battle wound down and the Cloudkill spells ran their course, Ludmilla joined her forces on the ground to survey the results up close. The western third of the field was littered with blackened corpses, victims that had been overtaken and succumbed to the deadly magic that she had ordered. Cloudkill was one of the few spells that she found suitable for large battlefields in the Elder Lich's repertoire. Even so, she had to come up with an effective way to deploy them, having a large number cast in tandem to create a deadly moving barrier. As it was described to her by Nonna, the spell was a noxious cloud that instantly killed those below level 10. Below level 19, there was still a chance for it to be fatal, and continued exposure would cause adverse effects to one's health. Anything stronger would still be subjected to its debilitating effects, but, at that point, it mostly came down to the potency of the caster versus the resistance of the individual. Being immune to poison made one immune to the spell, so it was an effective battlefield tool when one's army was 100% undead. Remaining high above the battlefield on Nonna's shoulders, Ludmilla was similarly out of the area of effect. As she picked her way eastward, fewer corpses showed the effects of Cloudkill, and the work of her undead forces left pieces of demi-humans scattered everywhere. It was a strange reminder of the arbitrary nature of magic. Those who had died of the spell had turned as black as charcoal, while those who had died to every other cause had not, even though the poisonous mist washed over them after the fact. While the spell certainly seemed convenient, she noted other details that made her question its use. Dead rodents and snakes could be seen occasionally, as well as bats and birds. Coming across a rotting log, Ludmilla drew her axe out of curiosity. After peeling back the pieces of bark and chopping out a section of wood, she grimaced. The spell was indiscriminate. Anything susceptible to the poisonous mist was affected, enemies or otherwise. Her earlier testing of the spell had been conducted high in the rocky passes where her zombies were stationed, so she had not been aware of the fact at the time. In the future, she would have to carefully consider the implications of its use. Baroness Zaradnik, one of the Elderlich commanders, called out to her from the southwest, "The survivors await." Survivors? With both sides having fully committed themselves to battle, she wasn't about to attempt something foolish like ordering potentially harmful measures to preserve enemy numbers, but she did leave several other orders standing. Amongst them were her instructions to leave the enemy commanders unscathed, if possible. She found a small group of well-equipped, dangerous-looking hobgoblins seated near the center of the field. 4 Death Knights stood watch over them. Nonna appeared to be making a study of their possessions. As Ludmilla approached, they turned their attention towards her, faces expressing clear disbelief. "Good morning," Ludmilla said. "I am Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, Warden of the Vale. 5 days ago, a contingent of your soldiers crossed over into the sovereign territory of the Sorceress Kingdom, attacking the official that asked for them to declare their business. The individuals taken in for questioning revealed to us your intent to invade our nation." A large hobgoblin in the midst of the group jumped to her feet and pulled her way forward. Ludmilla called her glaive into her hand, but it was unnecessary. A Death Knight smoothly stepped in and bashed the hobgoblin across the face with its shield. The demi-human took several more wobbly steps before tumbling into a heap. "General! General! General!" The other hobgoblins rose to their feet, voices raised in concern. "I guess I do not have to figure out who their leader is." The hobgoblin general sent a baleful glare at Ludmilla from where her cheek was pressed against the dirt. "You undead bitch." Flecks of spittle sprayed into the air. "I knew it wasn't just some damn elder lich doing this." One of the elder lich commanders looked at the hobgoblin general, then at Ludmilla. "Don't look at me, I never claimed to be undead. The fact of the matter is that you have come with the resolve to invade the Sorceress Kingdom." Ludmilla looked pointedly across the field, "and this is the result. I am curious, however, why would you think to bring such a huge army into our quiet corner of the wilderness?" The hobgoblin general froze at her question, then a chuckle rose from its throat. "I do not think I said anything funny," Ludmilla frowned. "This isn't the end," the hobgoblin general said. Ludmilla was not particularly well versed in romantic literature, but even she understood the ominous line as painfully cliché. "I realize that more of your army remains in the basin." "No," the hobgoblin general shouted, "you realize nothing. I'll accept that I was bested by a superior force, but the last laugh will be mine. Your evil will be destroyed by a greater evil. He will come for you, you undead monster." Ludmilla furrowed her brow and looked over towards Nonna. "Did the ones from the other day yield any information related to this?" she asked. "The interrogation revealed nothing relevant to exterminating these invaders," the elder lich answered. The hobgoblin let out a guffaw. Ludmilla racked her head, trying to make sense out of its cryptic words. "Evil, does this have anything to do with the evil star that has fallen in the west?" The laughter stopped. "Evil star?" The hobgoblin general snorted. "Which cryptic arsehole told you that?" "Well, no matter. No amount of preparation will save you. These soldiers of yours are nothing, too. Hell is right behind us, undead. Your sorceress kingdom will burn like everything else." "Explain," Ludmilla demanded. The hobgoblin general started to laugh again. Ludmilla resisted the urge to use her glaive in an attempt to loosen its tongue. There were people who could do this elsewhere. She had to return and compose her report to Lord Cocytus before Entama and Shizu arrived with the next contingent of army trainees. After arranging for the interrogation of the hobgoblin general and the rest of the captured officers, she ordered the elder lich commanders to start cleaning up the field. Once she set some shadow demons to ambush any incoming couriers or supply trains coming from the west, Ludmilla hurried back to the harbor. Along the way, she couldn't keep her eyes off of the Katza River. Nearer to the battlefield, it had become discolored, turned bright red by the tens of thousands of demi-humans slain along its banks. To her great relief, it faded somewhat as more and more streams and small rivers joined it along its course. By the time the river ran by the harbor, it was only suspiciously dark, or so she thought. On the pier, Chief-Ess stood looking out over the water with several other lizardmen. They froze upon noticing her approach, and she could swear that one of them pushed the chieftain forward. She greeted him with as much friendliness as she could muster. "Good morning, Chief-Ess." "Good morning, Lady Zaradnik." "Is something the matter?" she asked. Yes," the lizardman chieftain answered. "The river has changed, the smell and taste of the waters have become strange. So much for hoping that no one would notice." "The change should be temporary," Ludmilla said. "Give it a day or two and it should be gone." "What is it, if I may ask?" Chief-Ess asked. "Is it something bad? Will it happen again? My people are concerned." "Rather than something bad," Ludmilla smiled, "I would say it is good news. The main army of the forces threatening us to the south was defeated last night. The river is stained with the blood of over 30,000 demi-humans. As for whether it will happen again, I will carry out my duty as often as duty demands." As she tried to convey a sense of confidence to the lizardman chief, he stopped blinking and his tail went rigid. Ludmilla leaned forward and waved her hand in front of his snout, and he flinched backwards. She still couldn't figure out many of the stranger aspects of her lizardman subjects. "At any rate," she continued, "try to refrain from using the river water until the blood has washed by. I will have barrels of well water delivered from the villages if you wish." Yes, thank you, my lady." The lizardman chief returned to the pier, gesturing with his arms as he relayed her explanation. They reacted in the same manner as their chief, save for one who fell into the river. Over the course of her exposure to the demi-human race, she had come to learn that they were not very good on dry land. Even the ones that had moved to Erantal resided in the demi-human quarter, where a small lake had been made to accommodate them. Her mind started to wander towards her delayed development plans before she caught herself. She had no time to linger. Ludmilla turned and walked up the village trail, returning to her manor. "Welcome back, my lady," Laluvian greeted her as she entered, "and congratulations." Ludmilla's gaze went to the map in the back of the manor. It had already been updated with the changes that had occurred overnight. "Thank you, Laluvian," she replied. "Please prepare some tea, I have a lot of work ahead of me this morning." A skeleton stirred from the wall of the hall and made its way into the back to pick up the kettle from where it hung over the fireplace. Ludmilla took a seat at her desk, trying to figure out how to best structure her report. After several hours, and with about 30 minutes left until the next scheduled delivery, she thought she had come up with something appropriately comprehensive and coherent. She went down to the flats to prepare for the exchange. Entama and Shizu arrived exactly on time with the next contingent of troops. Delivery. The two sisters were attired in the same garb as always, vaguely made like uniforms that might have come from some exotic place. After a few days, she decided that Entama was wearing some sort of mask, while Shizu's face was half hidden behind her mottled green scarf and large black eye patch. "Thank you, Miss Entama, Miss Shizu. Here is the night's report." The two sisters stared down at the thick stack of papers. Entama was the first to move, dashing by and disappearing around the hill. Miss Entama is always so excited about getting more food," Ludmilla said. "I apologize for leaving you with all the paperwork again, Miss Shizu." Shizu received the stack of papers and seemed to weigh them in her hand before she started flipping through the pages. "It's okay," she said in her flat voice, "this is important work, after all." The flipping stopped at a certain page near the beginning, and Shizu's eye roamed back and forth over its content. After a minute, she looked back up at Ludmilla, silently running her gaze up and down her figure. Ludmilla shifted slightly under her scrutiny. Miss Shizu?" "Weapon," Shizu said. "Pardon me? Weapon, do you use one?" Shizu reached into her inventory, retrieving a variety of weapons. Axes, swords, daggers, they all looked both magical and highly valuable. Ludmilla grew curious about how many would come out, but she didn't want to waste Shizu's time. "I use a spear," Ludmilla said. "Then As Shizu drew out a long spear from her inventory, Ludmilla called her new glaive into her right hand. The pink-haired woman paused to stare at the weapon. All of the ones she had pulled out returned to her inventory. In their place, Shizu held a pen and stepped forward. Ludmilla stepped back. What are you doing? Drawing. Drawing? Drawing on what? Weapon, Shizu said, eyeing Ludmilla's glaive. Don't worry, it's permanent. Ludmilla glanced down at her weapon, imagining fluffy animals doodled on the pristine white haft of the incalculably valuable weapon. She wheeled it back into her infinite haversack. Shizu's mouth turned down in its ever so subtle way. This is a precious weapon bestowed upon me by Lady Shultier, Ludmilla said. I am sorry, but I cannot allow anyone to deface it. Shizu's eye fell upon one of Ludmilla's infinite haversacks, and a worried look came over Ludmilla's face. They had been exchanging troops for the past week and, in that time, Ludmilla found that the range of Shizu's visible expressions was quite limited. This was about as close to pure dissatisfaction as far as Shizu was concerned. Was she going to try and take it? If so, Ludmilla felt that she would have no choice but to let Shizu have her way with her. Woodlouse, Ranger. Ludmilla blinked at Shizu's meandering words. A bow, Shizu asked. Do you have one? A bow? Yes, I do. She quickly retrieved her ash longbow before Shizu decided to do something to her. After a brief glance, Shizu's frown disappeared and she reached into her inventory and pulled out a bow. Like the other weapons she had previously produced, it appeared to be of extraordinary value, a composite bow fashioned out of what Ludmilla thought to be horn and sinew from some beast. Have you heard of runecraft? Shizu asked her. Rune, apologies for my ignorance, but I have not heard of anything like that. Shizu held out the bow. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Ludmilla was going to say that the soldiers that were just delivered would be with her, but Shizu came forward and pressed the weapon against her stomach. Ludmilla's arms reflexively came up. This, rune bow, Shizu told her. Made using the ancient art of runecraft. Exclusive magical product of the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla held up the rune bow, examining it closely. It certainly felt ancient. She thought she saw a series of markings on the side of the shaft. These are runes? She pointed at them. Runes? Shizu tilted her head. Oh. Those are runes. What do they say? Shizu blinked up at her silently. Then does this weapon have a name? It looks quite old. Ultwa. Ultwa? They stared at one another again. Shizu's blank expression did not change in the slightest. Anyways, Shizu said after several moments, you should let many people see it. With that, Shizu wandered off, leaving Ludmilla standing alone with the rune bow Ultwa. She tested the pull of the bow, finding it fairly light compared to her usual weapon. What did she mean by letting many people see it? She still had the remaining portions of the basin to clean out. Was Shizu telling her to use the bow as often as possible against the demi-humans? Looking towards where the Sorcerer King's servant had disappeared to, Ludmilla wished she had stopped her to ask for a better explanation. She needed to keep an eye on the forces in training, but it was a well-established routine at this point. The remaining portions of the Goblin army were reported to mostly consist of poorly equipped training camps as well. Maybe she could get some training of her own in. Her bow skills had greatly fallen behind her proficiency with a polearm. After ordering the newly arrived formations to help with the cleanup in the Central Valley, she returned to her manor to see if any changes had occurred over the course of the morning. Willuvian had assumed her sister's post, and one of the elder lichers from the farming villages was awaiting her in the hall. Is something the matter? Ludmilla asked. There have been several requests from the villagers about when it would be safe to return to work, the elder lich replied. The farmers wish to return to tending the fields. Seeing the current progress in the upper reaches, I believe that it is a prudent juncture to relay their request. Would it be safe to return to the fields? She walked over to the map. The Goblin army had been pushed back to the southern edge of the basin, and there was no sign that anything had disturbed the zombies that she had stuffed into the passes or had scaled over the bare mountain peaks. You may rescind the advisory, Ludmilla nodded. But remain vigilant. The threat of tens of thousands of demi-humans flooding into the territory has passed, but we do not know whether a small group has somehow found its way in. The village security forces will be returned to their posts, but I will still need some bone vultures for surveillance. The manor door shut quietly behind the elder lich, and Ludmilla turned her attention back to the map again. 2 days, or at least that was what she had thought remained before she could go back to focusing on her domestic duties. Now, the hobgoblin general had mocked her over some doom approaching from the west, possibly the same evil star that had driven the Chronos from their ancient homes. Take the bone vultures that were watching over the main army encampment, Ludmilla told Willuvian, and send them to gather information in a radius of up to 100 kilometers west from the ancient pass. We need to find out what is going on out there.